Excellent. My name is J.D. Lunt, and I am here to host a discussion called Sharing Stories about veterans in White River Junction, Vermont. And I'm very excited to get to talk about this because we have a new anthology that is just coming out called A Whole Lifetime of Firsts, and it's really exciting to get to talk to employees of the VA as well as some fellow cartoonists and storytellers about this project. A little bit of background history. I am an alumnus of the Center for Cartoon Studies, and I was a student. I graduated in 2016, started in 2014, and when I started at the school, the president of the school, James Sturm, had started volunteering with the VA hospital and just drawing and being around veterans and starting to connect this cartooning school with the VA in general. And that eventually grew into an NEA grant to bring CCS cartoonists together with veterans, and we didn't really know exactly what that was going to look like, but I was very interested in nonfiction comics and had the opportunity to be one of the co-editors along with Kelly Swan on the first book that we did when I returned, and that just grew out of a couple sessions of getting cartoonists and veterans together and drawing and talking that came to formal interviews that eventually became short pieces that were collected. The one big issue with that is everybody involved, from the cartoonists to the veterans, were kind of opting in to be part of this project. And as it worked out with the first volume, there was a glaring omission. There were no women in the first anthology. And so that kind of brings us up to speed about how the new book, Whole Lifetime of Firsts, came about. To discuss kind of the evolution of that and how this book came about, I'd like to introduce Keri Russ. She is the Associate Chief of Mental Health at the White River Junction VA Hospital. And at the time that this project began, she was the Women Veterans Program Manager. So welcome, Keri Russ.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So JD and I met, I think it was the release of the first anthology, and I was present for that with several women veterans, one of whom is actually featured in this current anthology, and she was the one who really pointed out that there hadn't been any experiences or stories by women veterans, and I think JD and I actually talked about it that day. And we were both really excited to kind of collaborate and think about how we could do this. And not long after we really started talking about this and kind of figuring out, like, how do we do something like this? How do we get money? How do we get this off the ground? The VA introduced a new program.
The VA Innovators
the VA
Network?
Yes.
With the amazing acronym of VAIN.
VAIN. And Bryn Cole, who is our innovation specialist, who's here today, really shepherded us and guided us through this process. So we applied for a grant and got some money to work on this project. And we're really excited to recruit women veterans who are interested in sharing their stories. And we got them together, and JD can talk more about this, but we got them together with artists, really paired them up, and they spent months sharing their stories and featured here in this new anthology.
The way that we kind of did it, we learned from the first experience of getting cartoonists and veterans together. Cartoonists are a kind of shy and awkward lot in general. Not all cartoonists, but a lot of us. And veterans have their own issues as far as feeling safe and wanting to share things. And one of the things we learned really early on was getting cartoonists to draw veterans really opened up the conversation, because cartoonists feel very comfortable while they're drawing. That's what we like to do. And veterans, one of the first things about being heard is being seen, and being able to sit and across from somebody and really look and talk to them in a way that's much more engaged than a lot of conversations that happen in our culture now, where we sit across from each other and look at each other at our own phones while we talk to each other, really had an impact on how that worked out. So a lot of the conversations at the first couple sessions that we had together filtered into what the way the pairings worked out for the veterans anthologies, which was really exciting. So that's kind of what the next stage then was the interview process and cartooning, which we will be talking about with some of the cartoonists involved in just a minute. But first, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what kind of impact do you feel this work has had on the VA community itself and the women who got to share their stories or see their stories reflected? That's kind of a two-part question, but like, how have the women reacted to the new book, and also like, what impact is it having on the VA culture as a whole?
So one of the women in this anthology, her name is Mitzi. Brooke knows her very well as well, and she was really enthusiastic and really wanted to participate. And her story is difficult. Her whole narrative is actually is hard. She's had a lot of really difficult experiences in her life. But she was the very first person that I saw after I picked up the boxes of books from Dave Lloyd in the back of the VA one rainy afternoon not long ago. And I wheeled them back to my office, and I saw her the very next morning, and I opened a box and gave her a book. She was the very first person. And knowing her story, I knew, I suspected that it might be difficult for her to actually see it all on paper. And we kind of talked through how she was going to read it and where she was going to read it, and if she was going to be kind of meeting with her providers that day, if she needed any support. And she was planning on it. And she, I think, was just really struck by how, like, she opened it and she said, "Oh my God, this really looks like me." Like, she was really, really struck by how just accurately captured, her story was and how intimate it was. And I think it was a really powerful experience for her to share her story with the artists, and then to see it on paper was just, I think, it remains a really powerful experience for her. And to answer your question about the VA, kind of the VA, how it's impacting our staff and community, I brought copies to our leadership staff that same morning after I got them, who were just awed, I think surprised, and really quite awed at the content. And I think nobody could actually envision what this was going to look like, right? Even us, we couldn't quite figure out what this was going to look like in the end.
Just real quick, as the person who I worked on the Mitzi story. I wrote that story for the new anthology. And even in the process of interviewing her and hearing that story, just with that one specifically, I didn't know what it was going to look like. She was so awesomely open about her experience that I had enough material for like a 300-page graphic novel, and I had 10 pages. And, it was, so, I mean, none of us knew what this thing was going to look like.
Right. And so I brought it to that first meeting with our leadership staff the next morning, and people were just kind of thumbing through, and I could tell people were just really captivated by it. And it's kind of started trickling. We haven't had a big release yet because we're waiting until Veterans Day, which is a day that I think a lot of women veterans feel really overshadowed by their male counterparts, which is a lot of why, a lot of discussion we had about this book and putting it together. But so that's what we're hoping to do. But it has trickled out a little bit throughout our hospital and the community. And all we've been really hearing so far is just how beautiful and how amazing, and just how really impressive this is.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to transition into talking a little bit more about the process of making these comics. And so I would like to introduce two of the cartoonists involved who were writing one of the other stories. They wrote the story, Rachel's story, which was called Isolated Duty. And please let me introduce Sarah Yam, who is a faculty member at Champlain College and an oral historian, writer, and editor, and Kurt Schaffert, who is a fellow in applied cartooning at the Center for Cartoon Studies and a clinical chaplain and educator. He has worked with VA Connecticut as a chaplain in inpatient psych and palliative care for 8 years, and has volunteered at the White River Junction VA for the last couple of years. So welcome, both of you. So just to kind of begin, just a little bit about your backgrounds. Sarah, you're an oral historian, and Kurt, you're a clinician. How did these two different backgrounds inform your approach to doing the interview?
Do you want me to speak to that first? I was thinking about this yesterday, and I was thinking, did this create a tension? And actually, it was a really productive tension because, and Kurt will talk more about this, his focus as a clinician is on the relationship, what he calls the I-thou, right? And as an oral historian, you're focused on the individual story, but you're really focused on the individual story as representing a collective experience. So I was very focused on Linda, on the relationship with Linda, but I also saw her story not just, Rachel, her wife is Linda. I was focused on Rachel and Rachel's story, but also I was interested in her story as representative of the closet in the 20th century, right? And so for me as an oral historian, there was this outward-facing urge, this instinct, right? And I think for Kurt, it was more directly about Rachel herself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my experience as a clinician, especially working on inpatient psych, in Connecticut, where I started cartooning with folks and quickly realized working with my colleagues, this is really confidential information. And so thus was developed therapeutic process cartooning, which Brooke and I will talk about later. So it's about the process and not the product, and it's only for the veteran, and it's about the moment, it's about the encounter, about being held, contained, and borne witness to the truth that they're sharing, and really for that moment. So me coming with that strong protection of the veteran, where everything is confidential, creates a tension just by working on a project that then's going to become public. So I was constantly, that was the pull on my side, is we need to check in with her and make sure this is her story and make sure she's got buy-in in it before we do anything. So
right, and I think that kept us honest. And oral historians are also really committed to that. Nothing goes public unless the interviewee has committed to it. But definitely you were very focused on that, and I think it created a much better comic.
I would just like to speak to how I think held in that is that it's the more specific that you can get about something, the more universal it can become.
Yes.
And that's one of the strangest things about doing this kind of work. And that's been one of the things I've learned most from making comics about veterans at the White River Junction VA. Does the population of the White River Junction VA represent all of the veteran experience in the United States? Absolutely not. It is a very specific demographic that lives in this area, and there's different subcultures within that, but it's what you have. But by being able to get specific and grounded in real veteran experience, that allows people to make the empathetic and imaginative leap of, okay, well, growing up in this part of New Hampshire and going through this really connects to my experience growing up in Detroit, or growing up in South Texas, or growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area, or wherever. And if things weren't as specific, there might not be that opportunity to really allow people to make that empathetic and imaginative leap into the larger culture. Now, just to talk to you guys a little bit about the creative process as a whole. I know with your stories there was a lot of ground to cover. And how did you find the beats in that? Did you work with a transcript? What was the way of teasing out the story that you wanted to tell from the information that you had from the interview process.
Shall we use a visual?
Yeah, let's use a visual.
Excellent.
So this being our reflections together, then put into comic form, reflecting upon this process. One of the questions we were thinking about and resounded from looking back on it is, how do you represent a lifetime in 8 pages? And we had all this, we had manuscripts. I had graphic notes from when we met with her. Sarah was talking with her and I was drawing. This is a drawing from the interview time, and so.
And we transcribed every word.
And so, how do you boil it down to 8 pages? And there are so many components to a life, and so we just threw out lots of words and images, and particularly looking at the images that stick. And so being able to think about those and carry those through. So the description of a military hospital as being one long-ass hallway that she had to walk as part of her rehab. That became a really central image for us along the way. And the notion of isolated duty. When she was in the military, women were on isolated duty. They couldn't be on ships, even though they were in the Navy. So those sorts of things, and Linda and the post office that they worked in, and a mountaintop wedding, sort of percolated around. And how we boiled it down.
Yeah, I think it was when we found our organizing metaphor, and I think it was this idea of isolated duty, because we saw that, we were able to trace that through her entire life, right? So first she's isolated in Greece, then she's isolated in a military hospital, then she's in a relationship with another woman and is isolated from, the rest of the culture, and then now she's taking care of her wife who has a degenerative illness, and that's the most isolated duty of all. So we use that centralized, that organizing metaphor as a thread to carry us through, and enabled us to sort of let go of the things that didn't fit into that.
I think all of that stuff ties into that story so well, but just to push back a little bit, one of the things that really struck me when I read your story was that essentially it was a love story.
Yes.
And did you guys know when you were first putting this together that you were, talk about something that you don't expect to do when you're interviewing veterans for a comics anthology. You're not necessarily planning on telling a love story, even though there's that rich tradition of that genre in comics. But you guys wrote a really beautiful love story.
I have my notes. It's like the original documents of what we were thinking. It's when it happened. It was like, is this a rom-com or is it a medical narrative or
Right.
And so
Right.
she's active very much in VA activities. I came away going, oh, we need to talk more with her about all the adaptive sports that she's doing.
Right.
So it took a while to really sort of figure out which are the stories we wanted to pull through.
And then I think, Kurt, you've always said it was about honoring her relationship with Linda. It was the moment when she said the thing that I'm proudest of right there. I'm proud Linda and I have been together for 40 years. And then that did become her organizing principle. But until you said it, I didn't actually frame it as a love story, but it is very much a love story. Actually, could we show a visual?
Yeah. We can show
Page 21.
page 21.
We can just
Which for you viewers
Oh.
at home, you're
We can
probably
just put
seeing
it
right
here.
now.
Oh, sorry.
And
we
for
can just put it
you
here.
people here live in this packed studio audience.
I somehow didn't quite realize that's how we were doing this.
right here.
So this
Either way.
is on page 21, and this is the image of Rachel and Linda in bed together. But we wanted to keep that theme of isolated duty, and so they're surrounded by ocean, right? But with the stars above them. So it is a really beautiful image of a love story and a connection. But there is also this component of isolation.
To me, the title felt a little ironic in a way, in originally reading it, because yes, there is like these different layers of isolation, but at the core of this story, it is about a veteran connecting with her mother and then connecting with her lover, and it's really interesting how certain relationships can cut through a sea of isolation, not to be too literal here with the metaphor. And then also, I would also just like to say that piggybacking off what you were saying, Kurt, about how much do you share about the adaptive sports stuff, things like that. One of the another amazing thing about these books is even if the VA isn't directly talked about in any of the comics, although the VA comes up in most of them, but the VA, I mean, that's the thing that ties both of these anthologies together is one of the major supporting characters in all of these stories is the White River Junction VA hospital. And all of these stories take place within that context, but also it's not just a location, it's a place that is supporting every story and is holding every story that's being shared, which is just a really beautiful and interesting way of having anthologies, which is not, what we necessarily thought about when we first started out. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Petey the dog to the stage.
Petey, do you have any insights about oral histories and veteran stories?
So if I may,
Ironically, my original pitch for this panel was me talking about all the good dogs in White River Junction. So that really worked out great.
I also do just want to mention that the person who drew this comic was Rachel Ford.
That was the next question I was going to get into is so you guys were writing this comic together and then you had somebody else drawing that. What was that experience like? Because I also want to talk a little bit about the collaboration I had with the artist I worked with in my story, but please talk about Rachel Ford's amazing work in this comic.
I want to just pull a thread on the previous topic a little bit of what was important for me, also in us boiling down the story, was what was the purpose? I mean, for me as a chaplain, I kept thinking about, so what is the purpose here? And this is a little bit of our tension as well. And for me, it was, I wanted to honor her story and her relationship with Linda. And so that really gave the focus, as well as her relationship with her mom. So you're right in terms of it is a love story and it's about relationships. It's not a rom-com, as it turns out, but it has some really tender moments in it. So that sort of honoring was a grounding for me as we kept working on it. That was the question that is this honoring her, and how do we do that, and their relationship.
And I think at base, we listened to her story, we wrote out a transcript, we read through it, and then we were like, how does she really make meaning out of her life? Oh, this is the way in which she really makes meaning. Well, that's obviously the foundation of her story. Because she loved the adaptive sports, but that wasn't really how she made meaning out of her life.
Awesome. And so just now to transition into Rachel Ford's work.
Rachel Ford, yes.
Yeah, it's awesome. So
I knew her from when she was at CCS. She did a one-year program, and so I had a good friendship with her, which really sort of, for me at least, paved the way of, again, it's, you work on this thing and you're careful about it and holding it tenderly. She's out in the Yukon now, so we didn't see her. She didn't meet Rachel Arden. It was a little confusing having Rachel Ford drawing a cartoon about Rachel Arden, and that would get confusing sometimes. But my knowing her and having the relationship with her made me confident in sharing the story with her that she would do it well and do it with care. And it was a continual collaboration of sending off. Sarah did detailed scripting, and I did less detailed thumbnailing, which also is kind of fun to see.
there's some atrocious thumbnailing that I did, too.
Oh, that's true.
Remember?
You want to show that?
Yeah, sure.
So
this is what happens when somebody who really does not draw creates a thumbnail.
So that's
You
our
would
cover.
not believe the abstract geometric shapes that my thumbnailing looks like. And I'm not saying this as like a self-deprecation thing.
But that became...
But I just wanted to say, like, yeah, that's all.
It's all there.
That's super clear. Like
Right.
that tells you everything you need to know to get to that other image.
And check this out too. This is really, it gives me a shiver as I see it now. There's that image, like the beginning of the image of the bed in the midst of the space.
And I was in love with that image, right? And I mean, I'm like I'm a writer, so I create, images in my writing, but I don't get to see them, right? Like, I don't get to see the metaphors. So, I mean, all of you cartoonists out there are like, yeah, that's the point of cartooning.
Well, I was just about to say that's why comics are so much better than prose.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I definitely am with you. I mean, it was phenomenal for me to be able to see them, made so.
And then for us to have it, Rachel Ford then to work on it and then bring it to another level. It was, it felt like sharing a dream together, like exploring a dream together and sort of co-creating it together and using these different images. I think that was really powerful of, your emphasis and mine of, okay, what are the threads and what are the images and then what are the echoes of the images and how do images get transformed?
And she did transition so well from a dreamlike image like this to, moving us right back into sort of ordinary life. And I feel like this comic shifts back and forth between those two levels really well. And it's Rachel Ford who made that happen.
Rachel Ford.
Yeah.
And I would like to also just talk a little bit about the process of working with another artist. If you could put up page 9 from Mitzi's story. I got to work with Ronnie Garcia, who I've never actually met in person. And oddly enough, the way that the schedule for this comic worked out and stuff, I didn't even get to give her thumbnails. I just gave her the script for the comic, and she captured everything so beautifully. One of the things that I know I needed if I was going to tell Mitzi's story accurately was some reference to Coca-Cola, because if you go to her place, when we did the interview with her, my friend Jenny Blair and I interviewed Mitzi. Everything in her house, there was so much Coca-Cola memorabilia and all this red and white, and so it was so wonderful when I was able to just make a passing reference to that in the image of the pawn shop to have that, because like that's part of Mitzi's experience. And if I'm going to talk about the mental health situations she dealt with and her drug addiction and everything else, the only way it's going to really resonate as Mitzi as a whole person is if you also have the little bright spots like Coca-Cola. So it was really great getting to work with somebody who kind of got that and pulled all that together in the most beautiful and intuitive fashion. So, because we were both working long distance with our artist, if I'm not mistaken. Rachel lives in Colorado?
She's in the Yukon now.
Yukon.
Yeah, we never met.
Okay, and that's not in Colorado.
No.
Okay, just checking. Great. Okay.
Can I just say, JD, a shout out to you on those top 3 panels. They seem like pure JD Lunt writing, comic writing. Of the window and the different detail and sort of being able to look in. It's just rich imagery, and then the sequence of those top 3 seem.
And a quick shout out to James Sturm, because I had a much hokier image for the middle panel that James pushed back on and suggested the pawn shop, which if I had been in my right mind, I would have thought of. But that is why even editors need editors sometimes. So that was really great. But thank you very much. But credit where credit is due for sure.
And to amplify that too, in the collaboration process was then, us working with Rachel Ford, coming up with pencils, and then sending James Sturm the pencils. He did some magic on it. It was breathtaking to see his edits and go, oh, that says it so much more concisely than what we did.
Like, we were trying, this is the long ass hallway, we were trying to have it across 2 pages. Like, we had grand plans that just didn't work.
Yeah.
And James, it seemed like in like 10 minutes, just kind of rearranged it, and it worked perfectly. And we were like, yeah, that's what we meant all along.
Yeah, right.
Which is the magic of good editing, right?
Well, there's also just, I mean, anybody who's made comics for any length of time has made pages that, you make enough pages that don't work at some stage of the process, it's really easy to jump to going like, wait a second, this is off. You don't even need to know why it's off. You just can know it's off and try to find what's on. So I would like to, we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A, but I would like to transition into the next section of this discussion because earlier I believe I mentioned this, but I think it's really important to understand. I grew up kind of in the like 90s, late Gen X punk zine culture. As you could tell by the way I dress, I'm hella punk still. Really, I was really moved by the idea that the work that you put out there, the comics that you make, are essentially flyers. There was a great band called the Minutemen that eventually became another great band called Firehose, that viewed everything other than the live gig as a flyer for their live gig. Any interview they did, any album they put out, any single they put out, any poster, whatever, everything's a flyer or it's a gig. And I kind of hold that mindset. And one of the things that's been beautiful about doing this anthology as a way of framing this next part is that the anthologies that we've done get to act as flyers for a whole bunch of things. They get to act as flyers for the work that's going on at the VA that we're about to talk about. They get to act as flyers for the veteran experience. They get to act as flyers for what cartooning can do with real life stories. These anthologies are flyers for a lot of things. And one of the things that they're flyers for is the work that's going on at the White River Junction VA hospital with comics. And some of these comics are really not designed to have a public face in the way that these anthologies are. And because of that, our comics get to be flyers for those projects as well. So I would like to introduce Brooke Drew Robinson, whose name not only is a cartooning related sentence, Brooke Drew Robinson, which is pretty amazing, but she's also the registered creative arts therapist at the White River Junction VA, and she's worked extensively with Kurt Schaffert over the last couple years, working on projects. So I wanted to welcome Brooke and just kind of turn the conversation over to other aspects of how cartooning is being used, and begin with something you guys called the Clinicians and Cartoonists Lunch.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure working so closely with everyone from the Center for Cartoon Studies and Kurt over the years. I think we've had an array of experiences out there. I think the idea behind the Lunch and Learns for clinicians and cartoonists was really, we noticed that there were these two separate worlds going on. One was White River Junction and one was the VA. And being a part of both of them, where I feel like we definitely crossed the lines there, we wanted to blur those lines and we wanted people to feel comfortable in other people's spaces. For example, there's lots of numbers. If you go to a VA and the buildings do not go in order. So you could be in building 88 and then building 28. And
then like building B or something.
B, yeah. So it's very confusing. And we thought that a relationship should really start with everyone feeling comfortable. I know I've been down to the Center for Cartoon Studies numerous times, but even just parking in White River was hard for me, as I'm sure the cartoonists got our crazy directions that we drew out. And we were trying to wave flyers and direct people. But I think the idea was to also show the clinicians that cartooning is serious sometimes, and maybe not all the time, but at least from where we were coming from, it was a serious art medium, and also to show the cartoonists what they were getting into, I guess, working with veterans. What would you say, Kurt?
Yeah, so 8 years as a clinician in Connecticut, I was well known before I started cartooning, and so I was colleagues with them, and they trusted me, and we collaborated on a lot of things, and so I came up to White River Junction, where I wasn't known, and I was working with Brooke and doing the same things I had been doing in Connecticut, and we were getting feedback from clinicians of what's this cartooning going on, and even with the first anthology, I remember talking to one of my friends who works at the VA, and she said, I always thought like comics were just kids stuff or superheroes. She had no idea that it just, it took a long time to sort of educate. And so that was the idea behind my collaborating with Brooke is we need to, I'm not known here, and we need to take a step back and be able to build some relationships with clinicians so that there's clinical support for it and collaborations. So that was really pretty exciting.
Yeah.
And so after you were able to I got to go to a couple of those lunches, and it was really interesting to see who would pop in from the clinician world, and it was a real special treat as a cartoonist to get to talk to medical professionals. We often need that. And then also you guys have, or Kurt in particular, but you guys have been working with therapeutic process cartooning in inpatient and outpatient ways. Would you like to talk a little bit about that work?
Sure.
We have a visual.
Yeah, let's do the visual.
Early on it took about 6 months until I drew this cartoon and then edited it with the help of one of the veterans that we were working with. So you want to read your part, Brooke?
Sure. Hi there, I'm Brooke Drew. I'm a clinician, and this is my cartoonist, Kurt.
This is actually based off of the very first Garfield strip in 1978, and just switched out characters. And so thus
the thinking instead of a speech balloon, because Garfield's never said a thing.
Right. Hi there, I'm Kurt. I'm a cartoonist. This is my colleague Brooke, aka starving artist as cartoonist.
Our only thought is to hear you out.
Feed me. So we struggled with that line of our only thought, and it was a veteran that we had worked with for several sessions. We showed him the cartoon, and he's here, you don't have a right. What you do is you hear me out, and that really struck a chord with us.
Yeah, I think initially it was supposed to be like understand or something, and they put it in perspective that you really couldn't understand, but to listen.
I would like to just jump in for a second. In our work is oftentimes when I've had the opportunity to talk about this work, people have asked me about understanding the veteran experience. And I'm not a veteran. I have PTSD from working in the mental health field years ago and have worked through a lot of that. So I've been able to talk PTSD with people, which is real fun. But I'm not a veteran, but people will ask me about like the depth of understanding that I have to have in order to tell these stories. And honestly, no, like it's not understanding, it's listening. Like I don't have to feel this experience. It's not my experience to necessarily feel, but it's understanding that people have felt this and gone through this, and how do you communicate that to the reader? My job as a cartoonist is to create something that triggers that empathetic response in the reader. I don't have to feel this myself, which is kind of a little aside, but just, it has so much more to do with listening than quote unquote understanding.
And I definitely can relate to that because, I as a new clinician, like years ago, I was really worried that I didn't have like a quote unquote like game face. And then I realized that actually kind of adds to the rapport, is being authentic. And sometimes I think it's a good reminder to the veteran that what they went through is traumatic at times, depending on what you're talking about. And it's okay for them to see that that's not something that people hear every day. When Kurt and I were on inpatient psych and the outpatient unit, we learned quickly that the veterans may not have the same experience, but we did a lot of processing of what they were going through right now to be on the inpatient psych unit, and different rules they might have to abide by, and some things that would make people very worked up. And then I think that the therapeutic process cartooning, what it really did is serve as a way to get things out, things that they were angry about in the moment, not being able to wear a belt, or, and then we draw a little cartoon maybe of pants falling down. And it wasn't to trivialize it, but just to put it in perspective and give a little like, hey, this is happening. And I think some of the hard part for me as an art therapist, everyone wants you to have a finished product. Like as an artist, you want that finished product. You want to show your work off, and there was no finished product. Often we'd give it to the veteran, but many times we'd shred it. And I just always wanted to break that rule and take a picture, and Kurt was always there to keep me in check. And I was just like, but this is too good. This is hilarious, or this is amazing, or they'll want to remember this. And I think that was, that's the hard part about, I think, the work that we did a lot of times, was not being able to have anything to really show other people, which kind of led us to working with some of our outpatients. I don't know if you want to jump in or
Keep on going.
so we kind of went back and forth all the time saying, like, I wish we had something, we'd get some funding if we had something to show people. And I said, well, wouldn't it be cool if we could just make our vets like do a workshop in a book? And Kurt and I were throwing around ideas, and we said, yeah, let's do it. And I was like, really? Okay. And we plan to have the vets make their own book, which
I still haven't gotten a copy of.
Uh-oh. Kurt, you're in trouble because you
Yes,
printed
you
it.
are. But I'm looking forward to seeing it now.
Okay, good. This is the early release from 2017. We can blame it on my maternity leave.
There you go.
So basically, we thought it would be neat for the veterans. We only had the first book out.
Yeah.
And that we weren't a part of that, and some of our vets weren't a part of it. And so we thought, oh, we'll give them an opportunity to go down to the cartoon school, meet the cartoonists. And this was actually designed by one of our vets, and I think they drew it too, didn't they? They drew everything in this book, and this is what they felt like. We were leaving the VA with the flag, and the 2 pillars is where my office is, and driving down, and I used to have a little bus, and now it's a van, and we'd drive down, and I guess I'm the school teacher, and we went to the cartoon school, as they called it, and we stayed for 3 days, and basically it gave the veterans a chance to be their own artists, tell the story they wanted to tell, and they knew that their story was going out to whoever when they wrote it, and then just to give them some lessons on how to tell a story, and how to tell a story in 3 or 5 panels, or depending on the vet.
Yeah, we gave prompts. We worked with Kane Lynch, who graduated with you, and so had some modified what he normally teaches. We did a lot of prep with Kane, sort of understand where veterans were coming from, and so we made some prompts for them to draw on, and then collect and edit. Again, with the intent of this is something that you can submit to the Veterans Creative Arts Festival as a submission. So it was very much, do your process stuff, and then let's edit it so that you feel comfortable about putting it out in the world.
I couldn't tell you how excited I was that both of the veterans I worked with in these anthologies were in that workshop. And one of them, Kevin, had already gone through the process of being interviewed and telling his story. And it was neat to get the opportunity to see him embrace his experience and own it even further. And then also having Mitzi, who we hadn't interviewed yet, start to share her story, so that she was already thinking in terms of her experience and visualization and stuff by the time we did our interview. Both experiences, like, A, touched me super deeply, and then B, really either helped carry the work that had begun past the work that I had done, or like helped ramp up into the work I was about to do. So it was just on a personal level, it was really
That's
awesome to
cool.
get to see that.
I was really excited, and it was kind of eye-opening when we were prepping for this, Kurt and I realized that 3 of the veterans that I've worked with very closely over the years are featured in one of these 3 books. And I'm gonna open this up just to show you. For example, like, this is Rachel drawing part of the same story. This is her drawing of some of this. And I just think it's really cool that they're both in both books. And then Mitzi's story, I think we were saying, was like a jumping off point maybe for Mitzi.
Well, she was so quick to show us her story in the when we did the interview, going like, here, this is
Here's
what it was
part of-
like.
Part of her.
Oh yeah, where
drawing.
she's drawing.
That's her whole lifetime of firsts,
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
of
So,
rock climbing and such.
This is part of her story about rehab and the past. And then she actually loved it so much that, you know, we kind of put her to work and said, well, keep going. We'll give you more pages. But I think it was really, really amazing to just see the veterans at different points. I think that Mitzi really enjoyed the process of being a part of this whole lifetime of firsts, and then it kind of gave her also a real great appreciation for what the cartoonists have to do. And also, it's a great way to process these things. Like, I love the fact that Rachel is going to have this book for when, you know, whatever the future holds, that she'll be able to remember the good things as well as the process, because sometimes you can easily forget the good parts. And I think it was also neat to add, you know, without revealing anything about anyone's background, you know, different veterans have different things going on, and I think I advocated sometimes for things to be put into this book that maybe didn't make sense to the general public, but I felt like it was a more accurate representation of, you know, where different people were. And there was if anyone knows Kane Lynch, they know his cat.
Oh, right. Oh.
And,
I was about to say Peanut had to be in here somewhere.
oh yes, so there's a story.
Ugly cat.
Yeah, there's a
Take that,
story
Kane.
basically about, it looks like it's simple and a story about a clogged toilet, but really this is about medical issues a veteran was facing. And then Cat with Fangs showed up, which is Peanut, the cat, which is in like every thing that Kane draws. And he's like, well, let's just leave this out, or maybe we could move it around. And I was like, it has to go in. Because I do feel like some of the randomness is actually really beautiful in accurately portraying where people are in their life.
And I mean, that goes back kind of beautifully to, there's aspects of this work that we don't even know the full context of the stories we're telling as we're telling them. So that random stuff, that's part of the whole thing. We can write stories about isolation that turn into love stories.
Yeah.
We can write stories about abuse and addiction that turn into stories about a whole lifetime of firsts. and some firsts are really beautiful, and some firsts are really ugly, and it all kind of runs together. So I really want to make sure that we have an opportunity to have a question and answer session, and making this question and answer session even more exciting is that the director of the Center for Cartoon Studies, James Sturm, is going to come up and sit in the James chair during this question and answer session. So I will, yeah?
Could I, you did such a good job occupying this chair, and I'm so absorbed by your conversation, can I just instead ask the first question?
That would be wonderful. So as I was saying, James Sturm is about to ask the first question. We have a microphone up here. We have a microphone up here, which is going to be really helpful insofar as this is being live streamed, so that people around the globe can hear what we're doing. Take
Hi,
that,
everybody.
Flat Earthers.
I'm James Sturm, as you said, and I had the honor of working with everybody here at one point or another, and was just really, it's a very powerful experience. There was times when you're, trying to get deadlines done and you're trying to figure it all out, and sometimes work is work, but then when you go back to the veteran stories, you just feel like a real obligation, and you're just so impressed by how brave they are, that they put that stuff out there and trying to do your best to honor it, which everybody did just such an amazing job in doing so. So my question is, what a specific set of circumstances that brought a book like this out? There's a cartoon school right next to a VA. There's a cartooning chaplain, right? I mean, there's administrators that get it, and people that work within these institutions that can usher it. And is it possible for this type of work to be replicated elsewhere, and what would that take for it to happen? I drift back.
Well, first thing, I think it would be like a little bus of cartoonists traveling. But I think the desire is there from other veterans to be involved. As we heard from the first book, people love it, and then they find out, more and more people find out with the number of opportunities that come around. And I think that I still get consults all the time asking about where are the cartoonists, can we get back there? So I bet other VAs would be very interested.
I can speak from personal experience going to a couple of the VA Innovators Network conferences that the interest is there. Figuring out the funding and the logistics of something like that is a very complicated process, and there's a lot of moving pieces, but the interest is there. And it's been a beautiful thing to see as well that the interest is there on the part of the cartoonists. There were some amazing cartoonists whose names I won't give you because it'll make you cry, who were not able to make it into either of these anthologies, but were really interested in participating in this kind of work, and it just didn't work out for the timelines and everything else that were going on here. But there's definitely interest, and it's just figuring out the logistics for that kind of thing.
JD, can I speak to that a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah.
Please.
Sorry.
Please.
So, hi everyone. I am Bryn Cole. I'm the innovation specialist located at the White River Junction VA, and my program is what funded the anthology that we're talking about. Yeah, right? So exciting news, the VHA Innovation Ecosystem podcast just interviewed Keri. What, about last week?
And I was actually asked that very same question. Like, what if
Yeah.
you don't happen to have a Center for Cartoon Studies like down the street? What do we do?
So one of the goals of the Innovators Network is to incubate these ideas, right? Test them out in small local areas where they make sense. Here, of course, White River Junction, it makes the most sense. But we also look to scale these innovations, and ideas like this, aren't just, set to a geographic location. There are people everywhere who have stories to tell and people who want to listen to them and to chart them. So one of my hopes for this podcast is to get this renewed energy and interest in this project. It was funded last fiscal year. So this year we're demoing all these new ones. So it's going to be a throwback to really help get that excitement going again. And I also want to put another plug out there. Kurt and I were talking before we started the panel today that the Innovators Network is here to stay in White River Junction. So we've got access to this funding. So be it somebody within the VA, somebody in the community who has an idea who wants to test something and partner with us, come and talk to us, because that's what we're here for, to make these cool things happen.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
I cannot speak to how amazing working with the VA Innovators Network has been. Just a marvelous organization to work with. So supportive. Keri and I had the wonderful opportunity of getting to present this project for 3 minutes, for 45 seconds here and there. They would just make it shorter and shorter, and eventually we were just able to go, cartoons! That was rad. But it was just absolutely wonderful, not only to help refine the vision of the work we were doing, but also to refine how we talked about the work that we do. Because cartoons are awesome flyers, and also, like comics, they're great flyers, but also they need flyers. And learning how to talk about the work is as much a part of the process as making the work. It just doesn't take quite as long. Yes, in the back, can you come up and use the microphone?
I have a follow-up maybe we can tag for later.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear folks think about together, again, what it would be like in another setting. I'm thinking of all the relationships of how long I've known you. I've known James Sturm for 5 years, volunteered, hundreds of hours, known Sarah. So, a lot of this came out of our collaborations. Is it portable or, so I don't want to interrupt this question.
I think that's a really awesome question to discuss not on live TV. I really love that question. I just feel like this is a very difficult format to have that question in. But please.
Hey, my name is Karen. And one thing that I'm kind of questioning right now is comics and medicine, and how, what's the next step to kind of have this institutionalized validation through, is it through surveys? Is it through publication? But in what ways and what leaps are we making to kind of, validate the efforts that we're doing and equally kind of honoring the voice of the clientele that we're serving? In a nutshell.
I've always got thoughts. If other people have anything they want to say, that's great, but I can always yammer some more. Okay, I'm going to yammer. I think one of the things about this, and I'm going to speak specifically to the two anthologies that we've done, not necessarily the other work right now, but one of the things that makes the work kind of hard to quantify as far as saying what the value of this is, and also one of its strengths is that this work really focuses on different audiences and communities. These books have a direct impact on the veterans who are in the anthologies themselves. Their lives have changed for the better. That was not necessarily a goal in the work we were doing. We were just trying to talk about how miserable everything was because we're cartoonists. But these stories have had a tremendous positive impact on the lives of the veterans who've been involved in them. Also, this book is aimed at the staff of the White River Junction VA so that they can see and understand people that they've worked with for years in a slightly different way. I know that Mitzi's social worker learned stuff about her from reading this comic, and they'd been working together for years. But there's something about the way somebody tells their story and even further, something about the way somebody tells their story through people who have been trained in how to tell stories that can open that up. And at the same time, this work speaks to the community at large, not just amazing clinicians and academics and fellow cartoonists, which is a super important and amazing audience to have, but also people who might not necessarily have read comics and or might not necessarily have known the experiences of the veterans that they see every day in the communities they live. And then that's just here in the Upper Valley, what I'm talking about as far as the audience. And then when you extrapolate that out to the rest of the country, then you have these singular works working on multiple levels. And it can be a difficult thing to figure out, well, how do you measure what was the important audience in this? Was it the veterans? Was it veterans who identified with it but weren't in the book? Was it the clinicians who learned something about the veterans? Was it PR for the VA and the general community? It's a tricky thing to figure out how to juggle all that, but at the same time, the work is reaching all of those things. I don't know if that directly answers your question, but I think something's in the mix with that.
One of the other things that I envision with this in particular are, women veterans who are patients at the VA looking at it and seeing it and reading it and having something really resonate and bringing it in to either a mental health provider or a primary care provider and saying, have you seen this? This is me. Or, not literally, but there's something about this story that really speaks to me. And just, I think that it's a really nice place to start where the person actually is, which is something that in healthcare is something we all challenge with. We kind of want to go through these checklists that we have and, do these assessments that we've been taught, but like really starting with what the patient wants to talk about, and maybe it's something that resonated in one of these stories.
Thank you very much. That was a great question.
It is a great question.
Does anybody else have a question?
I just wanted to jump in and add to this. So one audience that I did not realize was going to be affected, obviously, like the book has not been released yet, but I have been bringing down different comics that have been created to our inpatient psych unit. So one of the veterans had told me, even if this story helps one other person, or even if it doesn't help anyone but me, at least the telling of it really, really helps. And every time you tell a story, it becomes that much more real. And real to the person too, kind of like writing something down. So bringing some of these comics down to the inpatient psych unit, actually, there were a lot of questions that I had, like, would this trigger someone? Would this be okay? And what I've seen is that people are just impressed and excited that someone would put themselves out there, and that could be them, and they could maybe be part of a project, or learn to draw, or there's just so many different things that I've heard veterans say in our little art therapy groups. So it's really neat that they're not seeing just like Garfield or Superman. They're seeing veterans in a book, helping other veterans that they don't know.
The first stage of being heard is being seen. That's what I was talking about earlier. Great example. Yes?
So you mentioned therapeutic cartooning in this, and I had never heard of that as a thing. I just was wondering if you could sort of expand on how you do that, why you do that, sort of what it brings to the whole therapy session.
So it developed for me in Connecticut, working alongside a drama therapist in a PTSD clinic and in the inpatient psych. And, frankly, it was me cartooning my own stuff and about the death of my dog and, having that as part of my life. And there was a construction project in the inpatient psych unit where there were 6 patients on a February weekend, and I was working 2 shifts. And I had talked as much as I possibly could with them. And I said, we're watching a Breaking Bad marathon on AMC. And I said, you guys want a cartoon? And they're like, sure, you know. And what I found from that was that folks were sharing stories that they weren't sharing with me or with other clinicians. There was something about the modality of, I or they would, draw the little panels and then fill it in, and it slows people down. It makes, it helps people focus. You go, okay, no, we're going to do this panel, then we're going to do the next panel and such, and then match it with images. So that would add a whole other layer to the verbal. I can talk a long time about this. Do you want to specify your question before I get going on a different tangent?
Well, I was thinking, because it's that difference between the anthology being sort of outward facing and the therapeutic cartooning being inward facing, just how that added, and like you're saying, slowing down, but sort of how you use that in terms of, is it a conversation you're having, or is it just something they do? You were talking about how, because it's confidential information, they have to be destroyed most of the time, sort of what that process is and how it sort of fits into sort of the more traditional therapy that's going on.
Yeah, so in the VA, there's sort of for chaplains, there's the 15-minute visit. And so how in the world can I possibly do something effective in 15 minutes with somebody talking about their whole life overview and stuff like that? So it boiled down at Mary Lou Lauricella, who's 30 years of drama therapy in the VA. She's here, I envision you doing this bedside with people in 15 minutes. And that's impossible. And she kept on me for years and years and years. And so we boiled it down to an exercise that I do with Brooke and folks, which is called the 2 Things on My Heart meditation. And so it's asking somebody a joy that's on their heart, and then eyes, mouth, and hands stage directions, and then a verbal statement about the joy, and then a guttural cartoon cave person limbic system sound effect, like grr or hrumph. So we get one panel and then reflecting it back to the person. So is this right? Do you want to change it? Am I hearing you right? Somebody was asking me last night if I've ever worked with blind veterans. It works fine with folks that can't see because it's about reflecting back the image to them. So we do a joy, a concern, a title page theme, and then an action plan from it. And we've done that a lot with, you want to give it a vignette obscuring the identity?
Well, I think the nice part is it's not really about the artwork. I mean, it is, but it isn't. It's like Kurt does a great job of giving stick figures like a lot of characteristics.
Just real quick, Kurt really does. Kurt really does give stick figures soul. So take that, Linda Berry. Take that. Okay, sorry.
And we have taken the stick figures, and it's what do the eyes look like? Are they excited? Are they sad? Are they looking to the side? Are they worried? Is it crying? So there's a lot of emotion in these drawings, and I think the fact that it's on a stick figure can really just zoom in on, we're talking about your story, and we're not there for the artwork. And I think the art therapist part of me is like, yes, I don't care what it looks like. It's about the process. But since then, we've even moved it on to using a puppy, actually. He doesn't look like Snoopy, but he takes it that much farther because, a stick figure is still like a human on paper. And so Puppy actually adds this layer of, it is not a human, and it makes it kind of funny and humorous. So it doesn't matter if you are going through something that really upsets you, when you put it on Puppy, you have to make it about the dog. So Puppy actually didn't lose his job. Now he wants to make money for, what is he gonna buy? He's gonna buy biscuits. So now we're not talking about rent, and we're not talking about housing, and we're kind of moving it that much farther away from something that's real. And I know it kind of sounds like you're trivializing it, but it's just not as close to home as using a person. And sometimes it's really hard to still describe a stick figure as needing money. So Puppy goes on all these adventures with different veterans, and sometimes he's making friends with fish, and sometimes he's, he's got a plan, and it's just, I think it really gives the vets a space to be a kid and be carefree and not worry about money for rent. Now it's Puppy's problem. It's not mine. So.
Is that anything to follow up on that, or is that we can get together sometime in the conference. We can do 15 minutes, and I can show you.
Sorry, I'm not
the one exercise.
Eloquent.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, please.
Hi. Hello. It was me that was asking Kurt about blind veterans.
Oh, it was Ian.
Yes.
it
Hello.
was.
Hi. I'm Ian Williams. I run the graphic medicine website, and I sit on the steering committee for the conferences and what have you. So this leads on from the last two questions, really. I do a lot of sort of 101, graphic medicine 101 talks, and generally evangelize, often to clinicians and sort of healthcare people. And I think this project is amazing and inspiring, and I usually show in my talks a picture of James. Oh, there he is, and the Cartoon Studies logo. And I have this great quote that James says, if I get it right, comics are a therapeutic blowtorch, and so far we've only lit a few cigarettes with them. And people always respond to that. And but what clinicians always ask about is impact, and like what what research has been done to see, and because we all kind of feel that comics make a difference, and yet people sort of in institutions are often very much wedded to sort of reductive kind of outcome measures, tick boxing, and I kind of hate that, but at the same time everybody asks about it, and I just wonder if this is sort of something that's kind of growing and evolving, and you're kind of thinking it through on as it goes. Is there any way of coming up with a kind of a novel impact assessment in comics form?
I think one of the. You want to say anything?
Oh, I don't know what to say.
Yeah, I think the studies need to be done and figuring out how to do that. I mean, I'm currently in talks with some researchers about collaborating with them and being in a position which is in the same institution as those researchers. So, I mean, that's one of the key things for me is when I left employment at the VA in Connecticut, then I wasn't in the VA and couldn't use researchers as I could when I was in Connecticut. So that's been some of the challenge for me of being in Vermont is then building that network of colleagues to do the research. So I would love to crowdsource in terms of how to do that. I mean, I've been trying to figure that out for the last 5 years,
JD, about that, I know I'm not really a data person, but I feel like, Keri being like the Associate Chief of Mental Health and having such buy-in, I think is huge. I mean, it's not an assessment, but I think that it speaks to the veteran experience because we've had such great support from the VA and the administrators and all of the therapists. I don't know, that seems like an assessment to me.
I know one of the metrics that we are looking at using in launching a whole lifetime of first with the larger VA community is through a hashtag, and having that be some kind of measurable thing of like X number of people from all these different places are using this hashtag in response to this comic. Like how much, like, how thoroughly scientific that kind of metric is probably not that much, but it does start to give some kind of quantifiable shape to the work that's going on. So I, as somebody who would love to do work like this in the future, I'm very, very interested in that question as well.
Yeah. We were asked that at Demo Day. I remember when we gave our pitch at Demo Day, somebody said, how are you going to measure this? And we were like, I mean, we've sort of been grappling with that from the inception, like how do you measure something like this? So it's something that we've been talking about and thinking about, but if you have ideas.
Oh no, I don't have ideas, and I hate filling in forms, and I hate kind of like filling in outcome measures and things like that. Partly because they are often just very simplistic. They're just kind of like they are designed for kind of counting widgets or something like that,
Right.
or they're not. They don't have this kind of deep kind of sort of feel to them of like,
Right.
you know, they don't measure the like non-propositional knowledge or whatever. So, but it's what kind of people ask, and there's very few kind of, as far as I can see, there's very few people study. Loads of people do comics that are meant to have an impact, you know, whether it's educational or kind of, you know, informative comics, but hardly anybody ever does like any measurement of the kind of impacts they have, and that's what people seem to ask for, or kind of like, you know,
Healthcare,
all
about
people,
this. Yeah,
because
absolutely.
policy is driven by numbers and whatever. Like, so.
Yep.
But I don't have any direct ideas.
I would like to live in a world where we could just point out the fact that comics nailed the meeting between Superman and Muhammad Ali, and movies can't even get Superman and Batman together right. Like, if you want an argument for the power of comics, that's probably the best argument you're ever going to get. But for some reason, that doesn't necessarily work with people who are counting the beans.
Running hospitals.
No matter how true that is.
We have this in the world of clinical chaplaincy. We have the same issue of that chaplains don't tend to be writers and aren't researchers. So it's been the last couple of years, there's been grants that have been given to help institutions and chaplains to then partner with researchers how to be a research literate chaplain. It's just resounding in this community of being able to have workshops about being a research literate cartoonist, and and being able to get researchers together, and even the workshops tomorrow, if there's some way somewhere along the line for us to be able to gather around that question, is a really good one.
We have time for about one more question, so yeah.
On the how do we study this thing, when you guys were talking, you mentioned that people who were interviewed said, oh, it made them feel better, or it had a positive impact. Where was that information coming from? Was there follow-up interviews with these folks, or was it just
in one case? Yeah.
Survey, yeah.
I mean,
some people don't go in for qualitative data, but that's sometimes the first place to start.
Right, absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Sarah.
we've been sort of talking about data as if it's all quant, but that it does seem like there could be a really well-designed qualitative study that could get at some of the like stickier elements of this. These were informal; they weren't formal interviews, but Kurt did bring it back to Rachel.
And I think many of the cartoonists involved in this have had some kind of even more informal connection with that, and that we've talked to the veterans afterwards. And I mean, White River Junction is a really small town. It doesn't seem that way right now because the conference is here and there's like 1,000 people or whatever, but it's a very small town. So a lot of the veterans that we worked with, we would see on the street anyway. And you see the way they change in the way they carry themselves. Even when you're not like going, okay, let's talk about how amazing this book is again. You see the way that people's body language changes as they're out in the world. And I think finding a way of doing some interviews about that would be a really helpful tool, because I know in it's the first anthology when I returned, my friend and co-editor Kelly Swan and I interviewed a guy named Kevin who was so shut down and kind of closed off, and his body language was just so turned inwards, and that's really changed when you see him walking around White River Junction now, just because all the stuff that he'd carried with him was able to be expressed, and he not only was he not hiding it anymore, but he couldn't hide it anymore, and that ended up being really freeing in a way he didn't expect. So getting interviews of that would just be a really great resource.
And remember, I did interview Kevin.
Yeah. Oh,
afterwards
yeah.
For that article, right? So that was
I-
for a journalistic article, but it serves as
Yeah.
some data. And he was very clear. I mean, and he had a really traumatic story of sexual violence. And he no longer, he didn't have to tell it to people. He could hand them the story, right? And so he didn't have to re-traumatize himself, but the people in his life could know his story. And so that was very concrete and
Yeah.
very liberating for him. And he was very clear about that.
Could I add one more comment too?
Oh, please.
It's interesting hearing about. I also want to. When we first started this journey a few years back with the first book, it wasn't just to let's serve these veterans and see how they've changed. Like, it was very much about a collaboration, and I wanted to see. I thought there was as much to be gained from the cartoonists as it was from the veterans.
Absolutely.
And I got to see all the, from yourself to Catherine, to Kelly, Sandy, like, who really engaged in that conversation. And they were able to put their own artistic ups and downs into perspective. And the cartoonists and clinicians, I remember we went to a luncheon, a lunch, brown bag lunch. Those were amazing. There was one right after the election in 2016. I remember it so clearly. And you brought somebody in to talk about vicarious trauma. And I had students that hadn't slept in a few days. And everybody, it felt like a bomb had gone off at the school. And the students that went there, it was like a lifeline. And for the students to be able to work and make those relationships. So sometimes I hear, yes, we have to study and see what they need, but it's also like, that's such a feedback loop. And we're very fortunate to be having the vets not as patients, but as partners.
There should also be studies done on the positive impact this has had on cartoonists.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, these projects have been life-changing for me, for sure, but I can say that about other cartoonists who were involved in this work. And I will only speak for myself now, but I had no idea what I was getting into when I started doing this. And it's been absolutely amazing and transformative work.
You can't read like Mitzi's story without feeling so inspired.
And so just to throw it back to everybody else, do you guys have like some fairly quick closing remarks you would like to make before the karaoke party begins?
Just to wear my humanities hat for a second, I think my closing remark is that these stories are now in the historical archive, right? And that's really important, especially as we've been talking about women veterans don't see themselves reflected. And so, both of these volumes have now added things to the archive, and that's vital.
With the balancing chaplain hat of the moment, it's the pearl of great price is that I-thou moment with a person feeling like they've been heard. That the phrase that Sarah has is Rachel's falling in love with Linda and losing her at the same time, and we could feed that back to her in a way that she doesn't when I see her around the VA. And we're able to, in those 8 pages, present that.
As a clinician, I have to say that everyone involved in the book, from what I've seen so far, is like they've done an amazing job at really putting the veteran first and protecting, and keeping them safe. And we had no idea when you go out and they're like your kids. You go out in the world and you hope everything works out, but the stories are beautifully put together, and they really just elevate that veteran, and I just am so impressed.
And thank you to the Center of Cartoon Studies for being such great collaborators and neighbors to us and great partners.
I would only like to add that both volumes are available at the Schultz Library at the Center for Cartoon Studies, so you'll be able to pick up both books while you guys are here at the conference, because they're really awesome, and I'm really, really proud of them. It was a deep honor to get to know and talk with these veterans, and an equally deep honor to get to work with such an insane talent pool. So yeah, please check out this work. It's a really special thing to be involved with it. And thank you, everybody here and across the globe for checking this out. Thank you for coming. And thank you guys. Oh my gosh.
Thank you, everybody. What a rich moment.